The Trumpet Daily program begins right now.
Hello and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily radio show. This is Richard Palmer coming to you from the UK, standing in for your regular host, Mr. Stephen Flurry. As he mentioned, there's plenty going on at headquarters with the summer educational program, Summer Camp, that he's very heavily involved in. So we have a few of us guest hosts every now and again to help him have the time to focus on that. Well, for me personally, the most aggravating news of the day is that we here in the UK are going to be forced to wear masks in shops. 9 people died on Friday of coronavirus. On any given day, on average, 460 people die of heart disease, 450 people of cancer. Coronavirus is dying out. The deaths are going down. Here in the UK, no evidence whatsoever of any kind of second wave. Yet now masks are going to be compulsory. It's a bit crazy. I could easily talk about it for a while, but there are so many other important things to talk about, other important things to get to. We'll talk soon, probably in the second half, about a key story from Europe that I doubt you've heard much about. We'll talk about some news from up there, the sky, the huge thing above our heads, some news from that I think is pretty exciting. But I want to start with a different crazy story from Britain and the US. As dangerous as a kind of fascist government or dictatorial government forcing people to wear masks is, a story that could be even more dangerous. And also just even a bit more crazy. Here in the UK, starting next month, if you eat out on a Monday, Tuesday, or a Wednesday, you can get 50% off your meal. It sounds like I'm giving the latest promotion from some supermarket or some restaurant chain or, some new gimmick from some car insurance company. Take out our product, get half off meals. The deal even has the usual disclaimers and exclusions, up to £10 per person, participating retailers only, etc. But this isn't a promotion. This isn't a deal being put forwards by some restaurant after business. This is official government policy. And it's being brought to you, if you live in the UK, thanks to the printing presses at the Bank of England. So here in the UK, the government is printing money in order to give me a half-price lunch. What happened to there's no such thing as a free lunch? Well, maybe there is such thing as 50% off. And if you live in the US, well, you're a recipient of a similar, though less gimmicky scheme where the government is giving you free money. Courtesy, again, of the printing press. How on earth did we get into a world where the government is printing money for me to get discount dinners? How can any government think that something like this is a good idea? And really, it gets back to the 4 scariest words in economics. This time is different. This time is different. I think it's clear to just about everybody over the age of about 5 that government printing money is not a good idea. It ends in disaster. Just magically printing more money doesn't magically make the country richer. It doesn't just more money rolling off the printing presses doesn't suddenly mean that there's more stuff to go around. Instead, that extra money just starts chasing the same amount of goods and services, and before long, it takes a wheelbarrow full of cash to go and buy a loaf of bread. But now, government's acting like they've kind of found the answer, the magic way to print money and get away with it. We're doing all the things that we know lead to disaster. Massive debt, government money printing, free giveaways. But we're telling ourselves that this time is different. We found out how to get away with money printing. And in the Western world, the printing presses are whirring away at an epic speed, absolutely unprecedented. So I want to talk a little bit about the unconventional monetary policy that banks engaged in after the 2008 financial crisis. And that can sound like a complicated and horribly boring topic, but it's not. This is critical. This is how the government is getting away with destroying your savings, destroying the future, but convincing themselves that this time is different. Now, because what they've done is they've come up with a way of printing money that rather than printing money and handing it straight to the government, they print money and then they use it to buy government debt from other banks. And we're going to try a bit of an experiment. I've set up a bit of a graphic to try and explain some of this. Sam, if you could put my computer up on the screen for us. If you're watching on YouTube, you've got a bit of a graphic here, a whiteboard thingy that I've put together. This is why my computer has been up here slowly sliding down the curved surface of our desk, causing me to have to keep reaching over with my left hand. So in classic money printing, the Federal Reserve or the money printers, well, they print money and they hand it straight to the government and the government spends it. And that always ends horribly. If the government wants to say use that money, wants to buy a bit more, to build more bridges, then maybe they go and they say, well, can you print us $100 million so that we can build more bridges? They then might try to use that money to go buy bricks, but there are no extra bricks available. All that happens is now there's much more money out there trying to buy bricks. Brickmakers put their prices up. And then the government has to go back to the Federal Reserve and the money printers and say, hey, can you print some more money? Because bricks are more expensive now. It doesn't solve anything. So we don't do that. We're too sophisticated for that now. We know that that is not a good idea. And instead, under this new quantitative easing and unconventional money printing, first of all, what typically happens is the banking industry lends money to the government. And that's how the government borrows money. The banking industry gets IOUs for that. And the banking industry can spread those IOUs around. One bank can sell an IOU to another bank, etc. And so what happens with quantitative easing is the Federal Reserve prints money and uses that to buy IOUs from the banking industry. So they're still creating extra money. They're still putting extra money into the economy. But the thinking is, well, you don't have some of these massive problems that are associated with that we don't have some of the massive problems that are associated with just printing money and spending it. And the idea is, well, the banks, they'll be able to get cash easily because they can just hand those IOUs over to the Federal Reserve and they'll have all this cash which they can use to loan out to other businesses. And this can stimulate the economy. And we've been doing this since 2008, this kind of money printing. And then the idea is at some point down the line, the Federal Reserve will sell those IOUs back to the banks and destroy that printed money. Of course, this all happens on computers, but you could think of it as the Federal Reserve printing money and then at a later date planning to have a big bonfire. And thus far, for 10 years or so that we've been doing this, we can leave my computer background for a minute. But for the 10 years or so we've been doing this, this hasn't led to economic Armageddon. So after the 2008 financial crisis, the US Federal Reserve created about $3.5 trillion. So a huge amount of cash that it created this way. A lot of money. And pushed this into the banking industry. This has pushed shares higher. It's made property prices go up higher. And it's also made it cheap and easy for the government to borrow money. Because everybody's always willing to lend money very cheaply to the government because they know the Federal Reserve is right there ready to buy up their IOUs. So in that 10 years or so, it's not led to economic Armageddon. So now the printers are whirring even faster. In response to the coronavirus, the Federal Reserve has printed about another $3 trillion. So if you think in the 10 years or so after the financial crisis, they printed $3.5 trillion. And then in the 10 weeks or so, I mean, maybe it's a bit more than that, since the coronavirus, they've printed another $3 trillion. They've printed almost as much money as they did during the time after the 2008 financial crisis. And like I said, this has made it much easier for governments to borrow money. And it's led to an explosion of debt all around the world. Because over the last 10 years, because of this money printing, Western governments have been able to borrow at a rate never before, or they've been able to borrow quicker than they've ever been able to borrow during peacetime. And normally that would push interest rates up. They would have to work harder to persuade people to lend them money because investors would be looking and thinking, well, I don't know, that's a lot of debt that government's got right there. If we lend to them, maybe they're not going to be able to pay all of that back. We should demand a higher interest rate, but that's not been happening because of quantitative easing, because companies know, well, if I lend the government $100 million, that's fine because I can sell that IOU to the Federal Reserve the next day, get some money back. There's not really any risk there. And so governments around the world have been able to borrow without any interest. I've got a couple of articles here. We'll just get to in just a second. You can switch on back to my computer screen, Sam, and I'll just show you just a few graphs, again, if you're watching, that show how quickly we've been seeing debt go up. This is from the BBC, but you can see how in the UK we're back to a level of debt that we haven't seen since we were paying off World War II debts. And on that graph, you can see just how right at the end with the coronavirus over the last few months, that debt has just shot up. You can see the same thing. I'm just putting up a graph now of US debt that's been going on over the last 25 years. And you can see that right at the end over the last few months, that graph has been rising faster than ever before. And I think you would have to go all the way back to World War II, I believe, to see that graph rising that quickly. There's another one from Just the Facts. Again, you can see the graph going almost vertically in 2020. America's debt is just shooting up, again, faster than ever before in its history. So we can leave my monitor for a minute now. But you've seen this in country after country. So for according to the IMF, you've had the response to this crisis has been governments around the world borrowing $9 trillion US. $9 trillion. And I don't know, I should have thought for more how to get our heads around that. It's just an absurd amount of money. More money than it's possible, I think, to wrap our heads around. 12% of the world's GDP. So basically 12% of everything the world would make normally in the course of a year, the governments around the world have borrowed. It's led to a global government debt figure of 105% of GDP. So more than the entire world economy would generate in a year is government debt. And typically, if that gets over 100%, if that even goes over 90%, that's viewed as being dangerous. So the world as a whole is well into the red danger zone. And that's just government debt. I mean, you've had businesses taking out massive amounts of debt. If you add in private debt, I think you're looking at an increase of 35% of GDP in debt compared to 20% after the 2008 financial crisis. So the point I'm trying to make is we are borrowing faster, we are printing more, much more than after the 2008 financial crisis. We still think of, I think, Corona in terms of the loss of our liberties and the way that it's been used as this political football and the deaths, and these are all important points to make. But this is an economic catastrophe bigger than the 2008 financial crisis. And we're not necessarily seeing that directly. I know certainly some people are, and you're starting to see job losses. But in a lot of ways, that disaster has been contained because of this epic levels of money printing and government borrowing. Now, here in the UK, the government's gone even further. They've gone beyond this kind of quantitative easing model. If we can come back to my laptop a second. So up on there, you see the typical way quantitative easing works. The banking industry lends to the government, and then the Federal Reserve comes along and buys those IOUs. Here in the UK, the Bank of England has decided to cut out the middleman. So now they are just printing money and loaning it directly to the government, not even bothering with the banking industry. Now, this is very similar to just a straight up money printing. The only difference is the Bank of England, instead of just printing the money and giving it to the government to spend, they're printing the money and loaning it to the government to spend. And in theory, that's going to get paid back at some point. In practice, we'll have to wait and see. Well, we can leave my monitor there for a bit now. And this is what's financing Britain's massive borrowing. So this year, Britain plans to borrow £300 billion. I didn't do the exact conversion, but there's probably somewhere in the region of 350, 400 billion US dollars. But 300 billion pounds, 200 billion of which is going to come straight from money printing at the Bank of England. So they're just printing their way out of this. The Spectator, their cover article this week, is the magic money tree. What can possibly go wrong? And that article states the UK government is being kept financially afloat through money printing by the Bank of England. It talks about those figures, and it points out, to put that in perspective, another 5 million will have been borrowed by the time you finish reading this article. We're looking at millions every few minutes being borrowed. That article quotes a senior Tory MP, Conservative MP, saying, "We fought the last election saying there was no magic money tree. Now we're saying there is one, and it's in the garden of the Bank of England." And this, I think, is one of the most dangerous aspects of this. It's not just that we're doing massive borrowing, though that in itself is dangerous. But we're also sending a message to voters saying there is a magic money tree. We can just roll off the printing presses. We have these massive reserves of cash that we can throw at things. And when we talk about my free government meals for the month of August, that really is being financed by money printing. The government is printing money to make it cheaper for me to take my family out to dinner, which may be nice for me, but that's not great for the economy. But this message that, well, there is a magic money tree, I think we're seeing that take root in the public of Britain and America. It's led to this complete unreality within our people about government spending. We're spending on anything and everything because we now all believe that we can just make money out of thin air and lend it to the government. Now, interest rates, well, I'll give an example, actually. So here in the UK, if people are under a certain income, then when their kids go to school, they can get free school meals. And the US may well have a similar system. I'm not as familiar with that. So people underneath a certain income, their kids can get free school meals. And so the coronavirus comes along, the schools are shut, so the government started sending the free school meals home. I can't remember whether it was the form of cash or actual food, but they were making sure that those kids that would have gotten free school meals at school get them at home. Well, now we're coming up to summer break. And normally, all of these kids, well, they would not be getting free school meals anymore because they're not going to school. But there was a big famous football player who started a campaign saying, or trying to push the government to keep the free school meals going all through the summer, to keep those meals going while there was no school on, while they were in break. And lots of people got on board, all across the political spectrum. Tons of people joining in. And if you opposed it, well, and they would say, well, what, you want poor kids to starve? Is that what you want? Well, if you oppose this, if you oppose free school meals, if you oppose paying for poor kids to eat lunch, well, you must be a horrible person. And they were arguing, the argument was, well, look, if the government can spend billions for this and billions for that, and billions bailing out this, well, why not spend just a little bit on making sure poor kids can have a good lunch? It's a tiny cost compared to all of these other things that the government's throwing money at. And they were right about that. It is a small cost compared to what the government was spending money on. And so there was this big initiative behind this. Lots of people got on board, and the government caved in. And they said, okay, free school meals for poor kids, we'll do that. And maybe that is a better spend of money than some of the other things that the government has been spending money on. But look, the entire country now believes that there is such a thing as a free lunch. That yes, we're borrowing masses of money, but we can borrow a bit more for this and for that. And we'll get behind these big projects, and the debt will just keep on shooting up. Because we all believe now that the government can just make us money out of thin air and spend it on whatever. And interest rates used to be a bit of a brake on spending. I talked about that earlier. If governments were borrowing tons of money, well, then banks started thinking, well, maybe they're not going to be able to pay that back, or, well, that's getting a little bit more risky. So maybe we'll just add another 0.5% on the interest rate. Maybe they used to charge the government 0.5% interest. Now we want 1% interest. And this would gradually make it more expensive for governments to borrow. They'd start have to spending a little bit more money on interest payments, and that would make them stop and think. And they'd have to think, okay, well, if we keep borrowing like this, interest rates are going to keep going up, and we're not going to be able to afford to keep borrowing, so we need to find some ways to cut back. Now that correction mechanism has stopped working. I just saw someone mentioned on the Facebook feed, accountability is out of the window. That's exactly it. There's nothing to cause the government to slow down, and that's really dangerous. They're borrowing these massive amounts because it's just one side of the government is printing money and lending it to the other. And the debt can just go up and up and up and up and up. And there's no change in interest rates because the Bank of England is just printing the money, loaning it to the government. And we've got in this crazy system. The Spectator, they had another article this weekend. Quantitative easing is a dangerous addiction. And they point out, well, who cares if the UK economy will shrink some 10% this year as our national debt rockets above 100% of GDP. Stocks are up, bond prices are up, and the laws of economics have been suspended. It's different this time, and all because of quantitative easing. We think we've got a way now of getting rid of all of the laws of finance and the economy because, well, we've quantitative easing. We can get away with this now. And this article talks about how, well, maybe in 2008 you could justify quantitative easing as an emergency response, as a one-off to the 2008 financial crisis, but now it's morphed into a lifestyle choice. And this article says QE is now the economic equivalent of crack cocaine. That's where we are as an economy. We're addicted to the economic equivalent of crack cocaine. And this started out for the UK as a 50 billion temporary rescue plan. That became 450 billion by the beginning of this year. It's now up to 745 billion pounds. But this article says, by holding back bond vigilantes for now, or by holding down interest rates, QE is facilitating vast government debts that will come back to haunt us. Monetary policy is now so deranged that around a fifth of all global debt is a negative yield, retarding global growth and storing up huge systemic dangers. And like I said, you see that in the US as well. Here, everybody have $1,000. And now Joe Biden's out there with his $750 billion spending plan. Well, sure, we can just hit print, spend all this money. President Trump is also not afraid to have some of these massive spending plans. And so going forward, I think it will be, well, we could afford the corona bailout. We borrowed massive amounts for that. The sky didn't fall in. We got away with it. We found a way to print money and get away with it. Well, we'll just keep doing it. And the debt's just going to shoot up. And with quantitative easing, there's nothing there to slow it down. The financial sector can't say, hang on, this is not sustainable. It's just going to keep shooting up until it reaches absolutely catastrophically unsustainable levels. This is the danger in the this time it's different thinking. Money printing always ends in catastrophe. I don't think anyone would dispute that. You could ask any economist, should the government print money and spend it? No, that's always a disaster. But we're saying, well, this time it's different. We've figured it out. We've come up with some fancy thing called quantitative easing, which allows us to do it. We can print money. We can keep interest rates down and have low inflation and spend lots of money and keep the economy from crashing. We have solved economics. We can do everything we want. But that's not true. This time it's different is a dangerous phrase. Now, after the last crisis, I've got a book I brought with me. After the last crisis, a couple of economists, Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff, they produced a book called This Time is Different. And to make this book, they studied hundreds of years of financial crises. They quote a trader who said, more money has been lost because of 4 words than at the point of a gun. Those words are, this time is different. Here's a quick clip from Kenneth Rogoff giving an interview about his book, talking about those 4 dangerous words.
That is the essence of this time is different theory that Carmen and I advance, where people just every time it sounds like it's too good to be true, people think up some story why it's too good to be true, and inevitably there's a bust. A country goes bankrupt, a financial system cracks up. It doesn't happen every day, doesn't happen every decade. But if you look over 800 years, the way we did, it happens an amazing amount of the time. It's happened an amazing number of times.
So we always find ways to convince ourselves, well, this time it's different. This time we've got away with it. Now, I should point out that that Rogoff does support the level of spending at the moment in response to the coronavirus. I don't want to kind of misstate his beliefs, but at the same time, I think a lot of their work is a powerful warning about what is happening, about this belief, well, this time it's different. This time we found a way to generate unlimited money. And he certainly doesn't support, though, the massive borrowing that has gone on before this and that almost certainly will go on afterwards. But their book begins, our basic message is simple. We've been here before. No matter how different the latest financial frenzy or crisis always appears, there are usually remarkable similarities with past experience from other countries and from history. You know, we've been here before, but we don't learn from history. We don't learn from history. I'll just go through another couple of quotes from here, going over some of these different patterns from history. It says, what is certainly clear is that again and again, countries, banks, and individuals and firms take on excessive debt in good times without enough awareness of the risks that will follow when the inevitable recession hits. Many players in the global financial system often dig a debt hole far larger than they can reasonably expect to pay from, or reasonably expect to escape from. That's exactly what we see in all of our countries. And, well, that's what quantitative easing helps. It makes it easier to dig that kind of unsustainable debt pit. And he says, what one does see again and again in the history of financial crises is that when an accident is waiting to happen, it eventually does. When countries become too deeply indebted, they are heading for trouble. And we've kind of convinced ourselves that we're not, that we found a way to getting away with ourselves. But it's not true. He talks about the frequent tendency to say this time is different. That advice, that old rule of validation no longer applies, is usually followed up with vigor. Financial professionals and all too often government leaders explain that we're doing things better than before. We're smarter. We've learned from past mistakes. We've figured out this thing called quantitative easing. Each time, society convinces itself that the current boom, unlike the many booms that preceded catastrophic collapses in the past, is built on solid fundamentals, structural reform, technological innovation, and good policy. So we make ourselves think, well, we've gotten away with it. We can do it. And just one last quote. The essence of the this time is different syndrome is simple. It is rooted in the firmly held belief that financial crises are things that happen to other people, in other countries, at other times. Crises do not happen to us, here and now. We are doing things better. We are smarter. We have learned from past mistakes. And that's the way the Financial Reserve or the Federal Reserve is operating. That's the way the whole country really is operating. If you have a Bible, I'm just going to read one scripture on this, one verse on this over in Galatians chapter 6. We heard a message played over the weekend that talked about cause and effect and God's law, and about how God's law is a law of cause and effect. By one of our ministers, Mr. Fred Dadlow, and he was going over this cause and effect, and one of those key verses here is Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7, that says, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap." So what he sows, that's what he reap. There's cause and effect. You have a certain cause, it's going to have a certain effect. And there are laws, you break these laws, you suffer the penalty. And man has always looked for ways to break those laws and get away with it and not suffer the penalty. And we usually convince ourselves that we have succeeded in doing that, especially if the penalty doesn't come right away. And maybe we have succeeded in delaying the penalty, though often at the cost of making it worse when it finally hits. But our whole approach in dealing with things is so often to try and find a way of breaking those laws, but stopping the penalty. And you see this in medicine. We'll break the health laws, live an unhealthy lifestyle, and then look for pills to try and help us get away with it. You see this in the way that governments will try and run things however they want, but then try and throw money. Treat the effects and try and throw money to fix the problem, and it never works. And you see it in economics. We think that we found a way to break economic laws and get away with it, to borrow massive amounts of money, to print massive amounts of money, to print as much as we want, to spend it on whatever, break all the laws of economics. But this time it's different. We have quantitative easing. We found a way to get away with it. But in this verse, God starts that by saying, be not deceived. But in verse 7, be not deceived, because we usually do deceive ourselves about this. All we've done is enable ourselves to borrow vast amounts of money, setting ourselves up for an epic fall. But God warns, be not deceived. You haven't gotten away with it. That law of cause and effect is still there. And some people with that grounding of history are warning about that. The Bible warns that there's still that law of cause and effect. Bible prophecy even had some very specific prophecies about what's coming afterwards, it prophesies a massive shift in an economic power in the world. It talks about a new power centered in Europe dominating the global economy. And that's why Herbert W. Armstrong looked at the world and said, well, there's going to be a massive financial crisis. And that's going to help bring down the United States and Britain. And it's going to help propel this European power to the fore. But you can tell that there's a financial crisis coming even without looking at Bible prophecy, just by understanding this law of cause and effect and not allowing yourself to be deceived, to get carried away with this wishful thinking that we've solved it this time. Well, we'll take a quick break, and when we get back, we'll look at an important story from this power in Europe that is rising, and like I said, some important news from the sky.
This is KPCG FM, and this is the Trumpet Daily. The Armstrong College Bible Correspondence Course is a distance learning program that makes the Bible clear and understandable. The correspondence course enables enrollees to learn what the Bible itself says about subjects that affect you and the world you live in. This fascinating Bible course highlights and proves what the Bible says about morality, war, religion, terrorism, and other current events, focusing on the root causes of this world's many problems facing man, as well as their solutions. The Bible and this course also focuses on the reason mankind was created in the first place, the way to happiness, accomplishment, and fulfillment, as well as the truth behind important doctrinal questions, such as what happens after we die, the nature of God, the resurrection, the millennium, and other critical subjects. Enroll today in the Herbert W. Armstrong Bible Correspondence Course. Email your request to td@kpcg.fm or visit thetrumpet.com. This is KPCG FM, and this is the Trumpet Daily.
Welcome back to the Trumpet Daily radio show. This is Richard Palmer standing in for your regular host, Mr. Stephen Flurry. I want to talk about some news from Europe now, some news from Poland. And it's an important trend. You had a Polish election taking place over the weekend, but it's a trend that is setting up the stage for a new world power rising in Europe. If you followed our material for any length of time, you know that one of the main forecasts that we focus on is the rise of our new Holy Roman Empire in Europe. And we're seeing something very significant in that rise taking place in Poland, and something that isn't really getting much attention in the West. So Poland over the weekend, you had the presidential elections, and the incumbent, Andrzej Duda, he won that election fairly narrowly. I think it was about somewhere around 51.5% of the vote. I didn't actually note that exact figure down. Maybe they hadn't finished counting at the time I was putting this together. But he still quite clearly won. And he leads the Law and Justice Party in Poland. And there's there's a lot, I think, looking at Poland and looking at what's going on here, that those of us in the West and in Britain and America might look on and be pretty pleased about, pretty happy about what Andrzej Duda is doing in Poland. He is a pretty close ally of President Trump. He wants American troops in Polish soil. He's kind of looking to America for his defense and trying to create a strong alliance there. He's also very conservative. He is pushing back against the global LGBT movement. He's called that out as being a major threat to family in Poland, a major threat to Poland's future. He's one of the few leaders in the West standing up to this movement. And you look in Britain and America, and all of our leaders are kowtowing to this and not wanting to do anything to upset this movement, whereas Poland is trying to get rid of it, and he's putting in place government policies to try and reinforce the family unit and to create strong families. So like I said, there's a lot that we could look at and applaud. But what we need to be aware of is that Andrzej Duda is really pushing, he's bringing in a very Catholic form of politics into Europe. And he may even be at the forefront of this push. There are other countries as well, like Hungary, but I think Poland is maybe even further along this. And Hungary, I think people have kind of already written off in certain respects. They're further down the road towards a dictatorship, though some of that is exaggerated. But they're further down that road towards a dictatorship, whereas Poland is bringing a strong Catholic influence into the modern way of doing government within Europe. The BBC, they wrote that Duda rides a second wave, or rides a second wave. I'm so used to hearing about second wave from coronavirus. Duda rides a wave of sacred tradition. And there's an archbishop. I'm not going to say his name because I will butcher that. But he wrote, from the very beginning, the history of the Polish state and the Polish nation were connected with the history of Christianity. Christianity, nation, and state were so tightly connected they were almost inseparable. So he's saying, well, this is Poland's history. Nation, or Christianity, and the nation and the state all so intertwined that they were inseparable. No separation of church and state in Poland. They're just tightly entwined together. And then there's another, the president of the Institute of Public Affairs. This is one of Poland's largest think tanks. And he talked about how priests were going around Poland encouraging people to vote for the Law and Justice Party. And in return, the party promises to protect the church. So you've got this church-state alliance on the scene in Poland. This president of the Institute of Public Affairs, he was saying that, he says, as long as we are in power, you have nothing to be afraid of. That's what the government is saying to the church. And you see this, you see this in some positive ways. There is some good morality that is coming through this arrangement, like I said, with the support of family. You see this in some very disturbing ways as well, though. The Catholic Church, especially in Poland, has had a really bad child abuse scandal. Where priests have been abusing children, abusing boys especially. And that's definitely not something that's building up families. But the Law and Justice Party has been helping to cover this up, helping to try and stop documentaries about this and get on the air and things like that, and supporting the church through that. You start to see a bit of a dark side in that. Deutschlandfunk, they wrote, many priests and bishops have agreed to a deal with the current world leaders. They support the conservative nationalist PIS government from the pulpit, and in many other ways. And in return, the PIS ensures them money and influence. In hardly any other EU country are the state and church as closely connected as in Poland. And then I'll just read a few quotes that are really remarkable. This is from a political scientist, Anna Grismelda-Busse. She is a professor at the university, or she used to be a professor at the University of Michigan. She's at Stanford University. And she writes, the Roman Catholic Church in Poland continues to be the most politically influential church in the Christian world. It has achieved most of its policy goals, including the effective ban on abortion. Again, there are some good things I think that are coming of this, but there's a danger here too. The church is a major political figure. Priests have blessed soccer games, and they helped ensure Poland's entry into the European Union in 2004. Well, isn't that interesting? That the Catholic Church helped get Poland into the European Union. 30 years after the collapse of communism, the church continues to demand policies, and secular governments continue to accede to its demands. She talks about how in a lot of other places, the Catholic Church's influence has declined in recent years, but not Poland. And listen to this. This is really interesting. So what makes the Polish church so powerful politically? Put simply, its ability to work behind the scenes. So there's more going on in Poland with the Catholic Church, even than meets the eye, even than just the more obvious priests and churches preaching to support the government. It says the most influential churches do not rely on pressure at the ballot box or on partisan coalitions. Instead, they gain direct institutional access, essentially sharing sovereignty with secular governments. So is that what is happening in Poland? The Catholic Church sharing sovereignty with this government? And then she goes on to write, such access can mean helping to write constitutions and everyday legislation, having a direct input into policymaking and policy enforcement, vetting secular state officials, and even running entire swaths of government. The channels of institutional access may vary considerably, actively participating in policy discussion and formulating legislative bills in special commissions, influencing personnel decisions, and taking part in national negotiations during regime transitions. Churches ironically gain their greatest political advantage when they appear to be above petty politics, exerting their influence in secret meetings and the back rooms of parliaments, rather than public pressure at the ballot box. A church's ability to enter these quiet corridors of power depends on its historical record of defending the nation. And so this is talking about, well, this is what the church is doing behind the scenes. That she talks about how it's very prominent in public, but it plays an even bigger role. That its real influence has been exercised covertly behind the scenes to secure access to the state, its financing, and policy making. And she goes on to talk about that even most Catholics within Poland don't want this. They don't want the church. Well, in 2017, nearly 3/4 of Poles said that the church was too involved in politics, and they said they favored the separation of religion and government policies. So because of that, the Catholic Church will publicize certain parts of its relationship and will tell people to go out and vote for the Law and Justice Party, but they're having to hide a lot of it because it's not popular for them to be so involved in politics. And so they are hiding a lot of this. Behind the scenes, the Catholic Church in Poland is much more involved than even you would think just by looking at that country. The one more quote from this professor. She writes, the Roman Catholic Church in Poland proved that it was able to accomplish the most when it succeeded in hiding its influence, both under communism and in democracy. And more, other people talking about this. There's a Catholic commentator and political scientist. So again, this is a Catholic. And he talked about how this Catholic Church working with the government unfortunately has tradition in Catholicism. We see it, for example, in the 19th century when the popes railed against democracy and human rights. Mr. Kaczynski, and he's talking about the Law and Justice Party, and his political friends are part of this tradition. They're part of the Catholic Church in Poland and the Catholic government and the government. They're part of this tradition that pitched 150 years or so ago the Catholic Church against democracy. The Australian TV channel, ABC Television, they had a documentary, and their foreign correspondent said, while many Poles believe a religious revival will lead their country to the light, others fear it is opening the gates to something darker. And like I said, you look at what the way the government has helped the Catholic Church cover up child abuse over there, and you can see that. You can see that that there's something darker on the horizon. It's that this isn't just about restoring family values to Poland. If it was, they wouldn't be covering up some of those parts of the child abuse scandal. And if you want to learn more about this, you can read our book, Who or What is the Prophetic Beast. You can get that on thetrumpet.com. And that's just a great place to understand what the Bible says about this. Because then once you get, the other way, I think you can tell that we need to be a little concerned or more than a little concerned, that we need to be concerned when we see the Catholic Church forming these kind of relationships with the government, is just go back and look at history. We'll set the Bible aside for a minute. You don't even need to understand what's in there to know. Well, just like these economists were talking about with borrowing money. Well, just go back and have a look at a bit of history and what has happened in the past when governments have worked closely with the Catholic Church. The last time I think we saw such a close relationship between a church and governments was in the run-up to World War II, when the Catholic Church was preaching vote for the Nazis, support Mussolini. And in return, these governments were putting the Catholic Church in charge of education and giving them money. And you look back in history and you see this same kind of pattern again and again and again. And it may sound good to have the Polish government working with this church, and some of the things that they are doing are better than a lot of what Britain and America are doing. But look at that history. And we have another booklet, The Holy Roman Empire in Prophecy, that is absolutely grounded in Bible prophecy, but also just shows how much of that history teaches us that warning. And then you can get the Bible out, and Revelation chapter 17 talks about an empire rising in Europe that is led by a false church. A woman is a type of a church in Bible prophecy, and this empire is led by a harlot, as it says there in the first few verses. It's a symbol of a false church. It's an empire led by a false church. And so Herbert W. Armstrong forecast for decades, watch for a church-state relationship to grow up in Europe. And you can look at Europe, and you could have looked at Europe becoming more and more secular over the decades and said, well, we don't need to worry about that. There's no way you're going to have a church-state relationship in Europe. Europe's kind of abandoning religion. Well, then look at Poland and Hungary and some of these other places where you're seeing that turn around now, and you're seeing the Catholic Church having a strong relationship with some of these people. One more quote. This is from Radoslaw Sikorski. I think he was a former foreign minister of Poland. And he said Kaczynski, he wants to create a Roman Catholic state of the Polish nation. His vision is that of Salazar, or rather Franco, talking about, Salazar was in Portugal. Franco was a far-right dictator in Spain. Now, he's a political opponent. He's going to paint things badly, but there is something dramatic happening that you need to understand. And our booklets, The Holy Roman Empire in Prophecy and Who or What is the Prophetic Beast, will help you understand that. But I wanted to save time for a bit of a conclusion, or for a positive conclusion today. I want to conclude by encouraging you to lift up your eyes in a very practical way. Lift Up Your Eyes was the title of an article Trumpet Editor-in-Chief Gerald Flurry wrote on the anniversary of the moon landing. I think it was the 50th or the 40th or something like that. I didn't write down the date, but he wrote that about the moon landing, he wrote that it projected mankind's vision far beyond this earth. And I want to talk about an opportunity for you this week to project your vision far beyond this earth. But first, we'll just look at a couple of scriptures that show that lifting up their eyes, projecting their vision beyond this earth, this is something that God's people have done for millennia. I just need to work out where I put my Bible. Psalm chapter 8. We'll just turn very quickly to a few scriptures. And this is from David. And of course, and this is quoted by Paul in the New Testament as well, but Psalm chapter 8 at the beginning. In verse 1, David says, O eternal our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth, who has set your glory above the heavens. And then in verse 3, when I consider the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you visit him? David was there considering the stars, considering the heavens, considering the universe, looking up and thinking about it. He was thinking about God's greatness. And looking up at the stars can really help us to see God's greatness. But he was thinking about, what's man's role in all of this as well? We can just look quickly over at Isaiah chapter 40. Sorry if I'm going fast. I have about 6 minutes left. Hopefully that should be plenty of time. But just Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 26. God says here, lift up your eyes on high Look up, lift up your eyes on high, look up into the heavens, look up into the universe, and behold, who hath created these things, that brings out their hosts by numbers? He calls them all by names, by the greatness of his power, for that he is strong in power, not one fails. So we can look up at the sky and gain a better glimpse of God's power and God's greatness. But then even more than that, in Romans chapter 8, and this is verse 19 to 23, but I'll read this from the Revised Standard Version. Paul, he's talking about the whole creation, that whole universe. He says that the whole universe with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God, for that creation, including all of the suns, the planets, the stars and moon, was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of him that subjected it, in hope, because the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and obtain the glorious liberty of the children of God. We know that the whole creation, so the whole creation, everything that's created, not just what's on this earth, but the whole creation, all of the stars and the sun and the moon, etc., that whole creation has been groaning in travail until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruit of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait for the birth as sons, as it should read. So lifting up our eyes, looking at what's out there, it can help us get a glimpse of God's power, but also of our future. That creation out there is waiting for us. God has a plan for us that involves the entire universe. When we're looking up into the sky, when we're looking up into the universe, we are looking into our future. Quite literally. And so looking up that way can help us get excited about our future. One of my favorite articles Mr. Flurry wrote, this was back in 2004, it's called Mars Reveals Your Universe Potential. And he wrote in that, here's a quote, "We're about to enter a very dark age. Actually, you could say Earth has been in the dark ages throughout man's history." And he talks about how how this is going to get worse, and we see that all around us. And then he writes, "In this world full of terrorism, we need our universe dream. We need to see the stupendous possibility and the eternal majesty. That is what will motivate us to achieve our lofty calling. Nothing can stimulate our imagination like comprehending our universe-building potential. Nothing." So in the few minutes remaining, I want to help you do something very practical to just get a bit more of it, to lift up your eyes, to look at that universe vision. And right now there is a comet close to the Earth that you can see from the Earth. It's called Comet Neowise. And if you just bear with me, I won't... Here, if you want to put up my computer again, Sam, I've got there's some pictures on Twitter that you can see where people have taken pictures of this. If you want to look up at some of this on our YouTube stream, the pictures look pretty incredible. I have to confess, living in England, I have not been able to see this comet yet because it has been cloudy every time I've been trying to see it. So, of course, people that take pictures of stars are very good at making them look good. I don't know whether you would see it so clearly with the naked eye. But this is a comet that you can see in the days ahead, up to July 25th. It's in the northwest, low over the horizon. Maybe we could just switch back to me for a second, because then when Sam does that, I can see the time. But it's northwest. Basically, if you look up, if you can find the Big Dipper, actually, if you switch back to my computer screen, just one more second, Sam, there's a graphic that will help you find it. So if you can find the Big Dipper and you kind of follow the bottom of that bowl downwards, it will point your way to roughly where this comet is, and it should be just above the horizon in the northwest, in the northern hemisphere. If you live in the northern hemisphere. All right, thanks, Sam. So, like I said, I've not found it myself. I am excited to see it. I'm looking forward to see it. And it's just a small thing, going out into the universe. Comets are 10 a penny, just even into our own solar system. So it's pretty tiny. It's not gigantic in the grand scheme of things at all. But it is a great reminder that there are wonderful and beautiful things out there. There's all of these crazy news stories going on Earth, and they can be aggravating, and okay, we have to wear a mask going into shops now. But, there's a future out there. There's a wonderful future. There's so many beautiful things just in what we can see. And how many things are there? How many amazing things are there in the universe waiting for us that we just can't see yet because we can only see what's close to us? There's so much, everything out there waiting for us, waiting for you. And we're going to go out there and beautify it. And maybe just looking at this comet can be a way to help you cultivate that universe dream. I'll just read that quote again from Mr. Flurry. In this world full of terrorism, we need our universe dream. We need to see the stupendous possibility and the eternal majesty. That is what will motivate us to achieve our lofty calling. Nothing can stimulate our imagination like comprehending our universe potential. So you could look up at the stars tonight if you're fortunate enough to have a clear sky to see that, and maybe that is something that can help you cultivate that universe dream. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. I believe Mr. Stephen Flurry will be back tomorrow. You can email the show at td@kpcg.fm. Listen on 101.3 on the FM dial or at kpcg.fm.